It's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce the final speaker of the day, my very dear friend, Rabbi Meir Soloveichik. I first met Rabbi Soloveichik when we were both in our early 20s, and at the time I wondered, is this what most Orthodox rabbis are really like? Stand-up comedians with photographic memories of the Simpsons cartoons and a sumo wrestler's appetite for sushi. Well, I soon discovered that Soli, as everyone who knows him calls him, is unique and uniquely remarkable. His intellectual range is dazzling, moving seamlessly from the depths of the Hebrew Bible to the history of modern Zionism to the greatest theologians of the Jewish age. But what makes Rabbi Soloveichik truly exceptional is his deep appreciation of American exceptionalism. And with his remarkable energy, running a center at Yeshiva University, serving as senior rabbi of America's oldest synagogue, meeting with senators and popes and heads of state, he has emerged as one of the moral and religious leaders of the Western world. Today, Rabbi Soloveichik will speak about how the improbable Jewish story offers mankind the clearest case for God. It is a message that every Jew, young and old, secular and religious, should want to hear. And I am excited to announce for the first time here today that later this year, Tikva will be working with Rabbi Soloveichik to produce a whole series of short videos, 7 to 8 minutes each, beautifully animated, powerful stories of Jewish survival and purpose that bring the Jewish miracle to life. Imagine Rabbi Soloveitchik's face, voice, and ideas on every Jewish phone in the world. A scary but still inspiring thought. Well, today you get him in the flesh with words that I believe will have transcendent significance and ideas that we hope to spread digitally to many thousands of Jews and non-Jews alike around the world. Rabbi Soloveichik, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. Everybody can hear me? Terrific. Thank you, Eric, for both your incredibly kind and gracious words. We've been very dear friends for many, many years, and so I want to thank you not only for what you said, but for what you chose not to say. And I want to thank you for your friendship throughout those many years. I want to thank Roger, really one of the wisest men I know, for his constant guidance, which has been a blessing in my life. And I want to thank another dear friend, Jonathan Silver, who works tirelessly for Tikva and has done, beyond everything else that he does, has done so much to help make this extraordinary day a reality. And I want to thank all of them for giving me the opportunity to speak here today. You know that you have made it as a speaker when the person who opens for you is Henry Kissinger. Several years ago, I attended the most unusual bar mitzvah celebration in my rabbinic career. A friend of mine had grown up in Kiev in the Soviet Union with no Jewish experience at all. Kiev's beautiful Brodsky synagogue had been converted by the communists into a children's theater. My friend, as a boy, would watch puppet shows there, not knowing that this is once where his forefathers had prayed. My friend emigrated to America. He raised a Jewish family, and eventually, with me, returned to the Brodsky synagogue, now restored, to mark the bar mitzvah of his son, and really his own bar mitzvah, one that he had never had. On our first morning in Kiev, I entered the Brodsky shul, took a seat in the beautiful, spacious sanctuary, began to pray, and was suddenly interrupted by an elderly individual who had come over, muttering incomprehensibly. I turned to him and I said, "Excuse me?" He looked at me and said, "Kennst du reden Yiddish? Do you speak Yiddish?" I was so excited at the opportunity to engage in communion with this Jew who had survived decades of tyranny. And so I said to him in Yiddish, "Ja, sicher kann ich reden Yiddish. Wir können reden zusammen auf Yiddish. Wegen was willst du reden auf Yiddish?" "Yes, certainly I speak Yiddish. We can converse together in Yiddish. What would you like to say to me in Yiddish?" And he stares at me. And in Yiddish he says, "You're sitting in my seat." This man has been waiting for decades for Judaism to return to Ukraine so he could kick another Jew out of his seat. Yet even this, to me, reflected the stubborn persistence of the Jewish people. The bar mitzvah commenced. My friend stood next to his son and read from the Torah himself, pronouncing Hebrew letters, Hebrew words from Leviticus that would have been incomprehensible to him when he first visited that very same site. Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach lo tichbe. An eternal fire shall burn on the altar. It shall never be extinguished. This verse is the source for the perpetual lamp in every synagogue, symbol of the enduring nature of the Jews. An eternal fire indeed. There I was, witnessing an event that testified to the indestructibility of the Jews in a land in the former Russian Empire, where as recently as my own childhood, a bar mitzvah would have been utterly unthinkable. And yet, this wondrous occurrence was in its own way predicted by a pretty smart man who lived in the Russian Empire. The Jew, Tolstoy once wrote, is that sacred being who had brought down from the heaven that everlasting fire and illuminated with it the entire world. He whom neither slaughter nor torture of thousands of years could destroy, who has been so long the guardian of the prophecy and transmitted it to the world, such a nation cannot be destroyed. The Jew is as everlasting as is eternity itself. An eternal fire is the image at the center of one of the most theologically intriguing stories in the Bible. Engaged in the most prosaic of professions, shepherding, Moses in Midian in the desert suddenly notices an eternal fire, a bush that burns but is not consumed. As David Galernter once wrote, the miracle of the burning bush is not the burning, but the continued burning. Those dry thorns should have burned to black dust in an instant, but time has been stretched out, stretched thin, and a moment of instantaneous combustion lasts on and on. The point, I think, is that if God on the eve of the Exodus chose to reveal himself in this image, the meaning is that more than the miracles of the Exodus that were about to unfold, more than the plagues and the splitting of the sea, it is this eternal fire, the Jewish defiance of time, that is throughout the ages the medium by which the divine is to be discovered. This is a miracle that will not cease, one whose theological implications are meant to be experienced by every one of us in every age. For me, this moment came this past summer, when my wife and I took our daughter to London. We had, in preparation for her bat mitzvah, studied together all of Nevi'im, the entirety of the biblical prophetic books. And now we sought to show her artifacts of ancient civilizations mentioned in the Bible. As tourists streamed toward the Rosetta Stone, we had headed to a largely unvisited space displaying the original reliefs that once adorned the palace of King Sancherib in ancient Assyria. By 701 BCE, the Assyrian hordes had swept over the northern kingdom of Israel, destroying 10 tribes in all. And then King Sancherib set his sights on the southern kingdom of Judea, ravaging the city of Lachish, southwest of Jerusalem, achieving there a victory so overwhelming that it was memorialized in reliefs in his palace forever. These are the reliefs that we were studying in the museum. Reliefs that were essentially, as has been described, films frozen in time. Images of dead Jews, their bodies flayed by the Assyrians, with Sancheriv's proclamation before our faces etched eternally into stone, "I give permission for its slaughter." With the city of Lachish destroyed, the Assyrians besieged Jerusalem, and another extraordinary artifact, the annals of Assyria, known as the Sancheriv Prism, crows that the destruction of the sacred city was imminent. And then, nothing. The palace of Sancheriv contains no relief celebrating the destruction of this sacred city. Assyrian silence resounds throughout the ages, and the Jews are still here. The Bible reports its own explanation of what occurred, and our daughter opened her Tanakh there in the museum and read the words. "It came to pass that night that the angel of the Lord went out and smote in the camp of the Assyrians 185,000. The story then ends with what I have always thought to be one of the most amusing verses in the Bible. Vayashkimu baboker v'hinei kulam b'garim metim. And it was when they woke up in the morning that they were dead. We've all been there, people. Thus was Jerusalem saved. If one denies the biblical account, one must still explain why Sancheriv's self-proclaimed triumphant besieging of Jerusalem went nowhere, and why soon after this the Assyrian Empire essentially disappears. If this angelic assault did occur, then it would seem to be the greatest miracle in biblical history. But, standing there in the museum with our daughter, a realization struck. We were the miracle. It is a wonder for 185,000 troops to be struck dead, but it is more wondrous for a Jewish father and mother to study the scripture of the Jews with their daughter next to an extinct empire's announcement of our own annihilation. Nor is the British Museum unique, whether in the Pergamon in Berlin's exhibit of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, or the Cairo Museum stela from Pharaoh Meneptah proclaiming that Israel's seed is laid waste. One can find in museums throughout the world obituaries for the Jews from civilizations whose fate was ultimately the same as that of Assyria. This means that one need not be in the desert in Midian to discover in every Jew an embodiment of the burning bush, a miraculous defiance of time. The Southern Christian writer Walker Percy put it best. Why, he wrote, does no one find it remarkable that in most world cities today there are Jews, but not one single Hittite, even though the Hittites had a great flourishing civilization while the Jews nearby were a weak and obscure people? When one meets a Jew in New York or New Orleans or Paris or Melbourne, he continues, it is remarkable that no one considers the event remarkable. But it is even more remarkable to wonder, he continues, if there are Jews here, why are there not Hittites here? Where are the Hittites? Show me one Hittite in New York City. Though, given some of the people I've met in New York City, if they were Hittites, that would explain a lot. So, where are the Hittites? Jewish history asks each of us, as the shepherd Moses did, to remove ourselves from prosaic concerns for a moment and to ponder why this eternal fire continues to burn. All agree, everyone has to agree on the following facts. Several thousand years ago, a seemingly insignificant people made the astonishing claim that they had been chosen by God to be the vehicle of his hand in history. Let's leave aside other doctrinal questions of who wrote the Bible and when and what occurred. This claim was made. This people also asserted that because of this sacred calling, they would be hated. And this people anticipated that they would experience exile and that, unlike any other nation on earth, they would endure and return to their land. All admit this was proclaimed, predicted. The only questions are, have these predictions come to pass? Have the Jews played an extraordinary role in history unlike any other people? Have they endured? Have they been exiled? Have they returned? What if, in a world searching for signs of God, the greatest miracle is right in front of our face? What if our story is the argument for God's existence? What if the chosenness of the Jewish people is actually the most reasonable explanation for our history. And yet, it becomes increasingly difficult to even ask these questions in our age, because we live in a time when for the culture, for the academy, and therefore for much of American Jewry, you are not allowed to believe that one people's story is more remarkable than any other, more miraculous than any other, more influential than any other. Shlomo Carlebach famously said that when visiting American campuses, I ask students what they are. If someone gets up and says, I'm a Catholic, I know that's a Catholic. If someone says, I'm a Protestant, I know that's a Protestant. If someone gets up and says, I'm just a human being, then I know that's a Jew. Nothing, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks once commented, could be more striking than the fact that a people whose very reason for being in the past was to be different, chosen, particular, should today define itself in purely universal terms, forgetting, surely not accidentally, that it is precisely in our particularity that we enter and express the human condition. The seminal Jewish experience for the past 2 centuries has been the flight from particularity. In the face of these challenges, it has become even more important to make the case for the implications of Jewish eternity. This can be seen from the life of Yaakov Herzog, the brilliant Irish-born son of Israel's first chief rabbi, who died tragically young, and who in 1961, as the Israeli ambassador to Canada, publicly debated the most famous historian in the world, Arnold Toynbee. Toynbee had argued that every civilization necessarily experiences 4 states, essentially: Genesis, growth, breakdown, and death. And there was, of course, one people that seemed to defy these rules. Toynbee therefore portrayed Judaism in writing and in public lectures as a fossil civilization, a remnant from the past that had ceased to be alive. And he further argued that the founding of Israel was immoral, comparing the Israelis to the Nazis. So Herzog challenged him to debate, and Toynbee accepted. The Israeli Foreign Ministry, showing their usual genius for hasbara, did not want Herzog to engage the historian, but he did so anyway, in a non-official capacity, before a large audience at McGill University, and in an Irish accented English that you can all hear on YouTube today. Herzog, who was learned in both Talmud and international law, eloquently defended the morality of Israel's founding and of eternal vitality, and won the debate decisively according to all who were there, so much so that Toynbee's wife was overheard saying to her husband as he went down from the podium, I told you not to do this debate. Now, at one point, I think this is after the public debate, Toynbee was speaking with Herzog, and Toynbee asked him why the Jewish claim on the Holy Land was different from any other ancient people's connection to their former country. Toynbee said to Herzog, he said, how can I explain to Nasser in Egypt that here comes a nation after 2,000 years and claims a right to this country? What, said Toynbee, what shall I tell Nasser if he asks me, what about the Vikings in Norway who settled in England 1,000 years ago? What if the Vikings wanted to go back to London? And Herzog replied to Toynbee that he would have a point. If there were still Vikings, logically, he said, you are right. But there is one small flaw in your argument. There are no Vikings that seek to return to England. How, he said to Toynbee, how can you apply to this case the ordinary laws of history when, as you yourself have written, over a score of empires and cultures have risen and disappeared from the horizons of civilization during the same period in which this little people has continued to exist? In the wonderful collections of his writings, largely forgotten, I think, out of print today, Herzog's book, A People That Dwells Alone, he later reflected on the meaning of this encounter. And he writes, so long as the world agrees that there is something unique about the Jews in the history of mankind, it cannot deny the right of the Jews to this land. In this argument on the character and position of the Jews in the land of Israel, the Jews themselves are a decisive factor. A great deal depends on them. If they appear to be cut off from their Jewish heritage, they cannot defend our right to the land of Israel. If one discards the idea of Jewish uniqueness in human history, it is very difficult to counter the argument of the intellectual. But if, on the other hand, The idea of Jewish uniqueness is accepted. Then, writes Herzog, then there is a reply, which is not only the religious Jewish reply, but which has a place in the world outlook of the 20th century, no less than in any previous century. Meaning, we are undeniably a nation apart, exceptional, eternal. The only question for Jews, Herzog concluded, quote, is whether this concept denotes a privilege, not an escape from society as a whole, but a unique role within it, or whether it is an anomaly which must be denied and discarded. That, wrote Herzog, that is the question of Jewish history. We meet today at this glorious gathering focusing on Jewish conservatism, which is rightly understood about Jewish politics. And yet, Roger and Eric and Jonathan have honored me by asking me to speak to you about theology. Politics all day, and now I'm asked to make nothing less than the case for God. This is a daunting task. This is like the joke about the young kid in a religious school, and his teacher asks him, and the kid is drawing, and the teacher asks, what are you drawing a picture of? And the kid says, I'm drawing a picture of God. And the teacher says, well, nobody knows what God looks like. And the kid replies with every confidence, he says, well, they will in 5 minutes. Okay. So, you have a full day of politics, and now comes Soloveichik to make the case for God. But the truth is that Herzog's story illustrates that perhaps this is appropriate. Irving Kristol, when publishing his collection of essays, chose an epigraph from Kierkegaard. Quote, everything that passes for politics today will be unmasked as religion tomorrow. Politics and religion are inextricably linked. The enemies of the Jewish people attack the state of Israel today, as Toynbee did 60 years ago, because deep down they realize that more than any other phenomenon in 2,000 years, Israel, the state of Israel, reifies the miracle of Jewish chosenness and the possibility, terrifying to them, that it validates the vision that Jews have proclaimed over thousands of years. It falls to us to embrace the implications of the miracle that our enemies, perhaps unconsciously, already know. Yossi Klein Halevi once reflected that living in Jerusalem, he's often overcome by the daily annoyances of Israeli life. Then he writes, I suddenly remember where I am. I recall my father's wonder at the Western Wall, whose improbable endurance he saw as a metaphor for the Jewish people. And like him, he writes, I ask myself what it is about this strange little people that continually finds itself at the center of international attention, repeatedly on the front lines against totalitarian forces of evil, Nazism, Soviet communism, and now jihadism, all of which have marked the Jews as their primary obstacle to achieving world domination. At those moments, Yossi writes, I feel gratitude for having found my place in this story. We must persist in making the case for the uniqueness of the people whose defiance of time itself remains the greatest argument for God. And we do so in the hope that there will be Jews who can still be convinced, who still seek to find their place in this story. And throughout American history, there are those who embrace their identity when one might least have expected it. Yesterday, I spent Shabbat with members of my community share with Israel in Newport, Rhode Island, at the site of the oldest synagogue edifice in America. Not the oldest community in America, that's Share with Israel, very important. I don't like to talk about it except every day, but oldest synagogue in Newport, the one visited by Washington. In the 1850s, the very same site was visited by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, then the most famous poet in America. He was a celebrity. At the time, no Jews were living in Newport. Longfellow came to the synagogue and found it locked. And so he strolled down the street and visited the graves of the Jews who had built the building. And there he penned a poem titled The Jewish Cemetery in Newport, which would have been read by his devotees all over America. And he wrote, closed are the portals of their synagogue. No psalms of David now the silence break. No rabbi reads the ancient Decalogue. In the grand dialect, the prophets spake. For Longfellow, this experience bespoke a people that had ceased to live. And like Toynbee, he concluded his own poem with a description of Jewish fossilization. Longfellow wrote, "But what once has been shall be no more. The groaning earth in travail and in pain brings forth its races, but does not restore, and dead nations never rise again." This is Longfellow. Only several years later, a young Jewish woman by the name of Emma Lazarus came on vacation to Newport. She was raised in wealth and privilege. Her parents had already abandoned rigorous Jewish observance, and the path of assimilation, of flight from particularity, was readily open to her. Lazarus visited the synagogue, already a gifted poet. Longfellow's description of her people's demise was well known to her. Something, national indignation, family pride, or profound religious insight, welled up within her, and this teenager penned a poem in response, written in the same meter as Longfellow's, titled "In the Jewish Synagogue at Newport," wherein she made the case that Longfellow had failed to understand the miraculous eternity of the Jew, the fire which Moses had first glimpsed in the wilderness, the symbol of the one nation that cannot die. In sharp contrast to Longfellow's conclusion, her own final words are as follows: Nevertheless, the sacred shrine is holy yet, with its lone floors where reverent feet once trod. Take off your shoes as by the burning bush, before the mystery of death and God. So she wrote, 18 years old. It was awe-inspiring to read these words yesterday, words of a member of my congregation, while leading services in the very same synagogue. But the truth is, her words apply equally to the Brodsky Synagogue in Kiev or to anywhere else where Judaism was deemed dead. Few of us have the eloquence of Yaakov Herzog or the poetic power of Emma Lazarus. But for me, even they cannot match the simple beauty of a Jew in Russian accented Hebrew that he did not know as a boy, reverently and miraculously standing at the Torah, pronouncing the words, Eish tamid tukad al hamizbeach, lo tichbeh. The eternal fire of the Jews is undeniable. The only question is whether we have the will to see it, the courage to make the case for it, and the loyalty to live by its luminance. Thank you very much.